Hello and welcome back to the Coaching Theory Lectures. We have on our next slideshow is heart rate training and all about heart rate training. So what is heart rate training? So instead of training at a specific pace, you use a heart rate monitor to train a specific effort level for a set amount of time. The idea behind heart rate based training is that you train your aerobic system without overstressing your skeletal or muscular systems. This quote is by Erin Carr, a personal trainer. Um, so there are many different types of heart rate systems. There's some that are wrist-based. There are some that are chest-based. The chest-based ones tend to be a little bit more accurate than the wrist-based ones, but wrist-based technology has come out with some spectacular technology that works for the mass population and works for the mass amounts of training that we do. Unless we're really changing up our speeds quite a bit or our efforts quite a bit and really need a little bit more data, we don't particularly need a chest strap, but those do come in handy when you need to be a little bit more on point with exactly what type of heart rate you're going to be using. Now, there are many different uh, technologies out there and products out there. Garmin has a bunch. Koros is another one, as well as Polar is another brand as well that does heart rate variability training. So heart rate training is just all about training by pace. Or training by effort instead of pace. So we train by the amount of 4 week workload that we may have under our belts. The idea being that maybe you trained too hard in the past 3 weeks. Well, your training probably needs to be a little bit less if you've hit that overtraining point. So we have our maximum heart rate and our resting heart rates. Maximum heart rate, really terrible calculation, is 220 minus your age. This is just a basic calculation for the mass population, not for those who train continuously of their cardiovascular system. So if you're trained continuously and consistently, your maximum heart rate should be higher. I'm currently in 2020. I'm currently 31 years old, and my maximum heart rate is still about 200, whereas others who are about my age who don't do consistent cardiovascular training would be significantly lower. They'd be around 189. So that is what we want to understand, is that this calculation is just for those who are a little bit more sedentary in their lifestyle and not those who work out consistently. So this is a big suggestion of why we should work out consistently throughout our lives and not just when we're younger or not when we just want to lose weight or get in shape. So a higher maximum heart rate typically indicates a stronger cardiovascular system. Now, there are some people who may have exceptionally high or exceptionally low heart rates. I had a, a coach friend who had an athlete that their maximum heart rate, we didn't really know, actually. She would get on the treadmill for an easy run, and her heart rate would skyrocket to 240 beats per minute. It was like kind of an exception type deal, and we were looking at her like, ooh, this isn't good. So we recommended that she go to the doctor just to be checked out. Turned out everything was okay. She just has a much higher heart rate than most people, and that's not typical. Typically, it's more the 220 minus your age for sedentary individuals. I've had some athletes who are exceptionally low. Their maximum heart rates at 18 years old are like 140. It's pretty amazing looking at that, but those things do happen. So it's not an end all be all, but you just need to know your own body. Then you have resting heart rate, which is your lowest heart rate when you're sleeping, or basically once you wake up, you take your heart rate for a full minute while lying in bed. That's your resting heart rate. So a lower resting heart rate typically indicates a stronger cardiovascular system. So someone who has 60 beats per minute at their resting heart rate might be a little stronger than someone who has a resting heart rate of 70 beats per minute. And then some pro athletes go in the 30s or even the 20s for their resting heart rate. So it depends on yourself and knowing your resting heart rate, knowing your maximum heart rate, and seeing how they develop. If you can see that movement, if you see this year I'm at 60 beats per minute, and next year on the same day I'm now 55 beats per minute consistently for a week, then you can see that you've had a good progression for your strength of your cardiovascular system. So on the right, there is a chart here that talks about exercise zones and beats per minute. We are going to talk about all of these things, but I just wanted to kind of show you that your heart rate drops as you age. And this generally happens for all individuals, but not typically in this fashion unless you're more sedentary. So sedentary is at 1 beat per minute per age, but most likely if you're consistent with your training and your cardiovascular exercise, your maximum heart rate should not decrease this rapidly. So we're going to talk about heart rate training zones. There are 8 heart rate training zones. We have 1, 2, 3, and 4, which are all the aerobic zones. Then we're going to talk about zone 5, which is all anaerobic zones. So aerobic zones are basically the zones where we're using oxygen as the primary source of energy for our energy systems. And then we have anaerobic zones, which we're primarily using creating energy without oxygen. Those zones are 5A, 5B1, 5B2, and 5C. The 5B1 and 5B2 don't come into play as much for cardio training. It more comes into play when you relate it to weight training and different weights and strength resistance training that you might be doing. So eventually we'll pull that all together into one wrap up for metabolics, heart rate training, and so forth. So, heart rate training zones. We have our first zone. You can see that at the bottom of the chart. In this chart, we have heart rate zone. So what it does, the goal of that particular zone. Then we have heart rate zone, which zone it is. All right. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5A, 5B1, 5B2, or 5C. Then we have heart rate number, so how many beats per minute, generally speaking. And I am using someone with a heart rate max of around 200. So all of your heart rate zones are going to be based off of whatever your maximum heart rate is. And so these numbers are more based off a maximum heart rate of about 200. And then how much rest you need in between intervals if you're training within a particular zone. So we have recovery as heart rate zone number 1. And our heart rate might be between 120 to 140 beats per minute. It's very low for someone who has a maximum heart rate of about 200. And you just continuously can exercise in this zone. It's very, very slow. My running class was burned out, or many of my running classes, actually my swimming classes were too. All of you were burned out quite a bit over the past week. So I decided, okay, we're going to do recovery days, basically where we just kind of release that stress. We keep our intensity low, we keep our structure low, and allows us to kind of de-stress and move to the next level and really get ourselves prepped and hopefully get ourselves motivated for some of the workouts that might be coming up. So we did a few workouts in this recovery zone where we just kind of trotted along real slowly and just kind of kept it low intensity. Heart rate zone number 2 is the endurance zone. So this is where if you're doing a long run or a long swim, you get onto the road and you go an hour and a half, 2 hours long, even an hour. This is where that endurance zone is. So where you just kind of keep it in the zone, you don't go any higher, and you keep it at this intensity, and you can go for that hour and a half, 2 hours, even 2.5 to 3 hours for a particular workout, just continuously. So that is the goal, right? So we talked about this first column as the goal of whatever workout you may be doing. If you're trying to do a recovery workout where you're just trying to improve blood flow and recover faster from one workout to the next, that would be the recovery zone. But then if you want to do an endurance zone, that longer cardio, so that hour plus, we're looking at the endurance zone of 140 to 157 beats per minute. Again, continuous. You're just going on for that amount of time. Then you go to zone number 3, and you have the tempo zone. So this is where you kind of kick it up a notch. You start pushing your racing limits a little bit more, and you start breathing a little bit heavier. There's something called the talk test. So where you can, and this can't really apply to swimming too much, but it does apply to running quite a bit or cycling, where if you're going along at a specific pace, recovery zone, endurance zone, you should be able to get out full conversations, full sentences with no problem whatsoever. Tempo zone, you should be able to maybe get out a sentence and then need to take a couple breaths and then get another sentence out before you have to take a couple more breaths. And that is 157 to 170 beats per minute. This is where you're pushing. You're starting to push hard. You're trying to train, kind of push that intensity a bit. And you're not going all out racing, but you're training hard. It's one of your harder workouts for the week. So again, continuous. Now, granted, you wouldn't do this continuous for an entire workout. Normally, there's structure, and structure in workouts allows you to be able to push different intensities at different times for different goals. But just know that this zone is that tempo zone where you're starting to push the pace quite a bit and starting to push your limits a little bit. Then we have the last aerobic zone. Last aerobic zone is called the sub-threshold zone. This is your racing zone, especially for anything longer than, say, anything longer than 2 minutes, especially. And then it just keeps going from there. I mean, a 15-minute race, your sub-threshold zone is very much in play. All right, 15 minutes and more. Now, granted, there's something called cardiac drift where your heart rate may, if you're racing for an hour and a half, 2 hours, you may actually have to stay in the tempo zone, because even if you're staying at the same pace, your heart rate may be pushed into the sub-threshold zone just from that regular fatigue that occurs with the human body. So that's called cardiac drift. And so we have this sub-threshold zone that is our racing zone. We're pushing, we're redlining. If we push any harder, we won't be able to go for much longer. We'll have to take a break because you're getting into that anaerobic zone. But the sub-threshold zone would be your racing zone. So this is where in talk test, you should be able to get out a word or two and then need to take breaths. Now, this doesn't work for everyone, all right? As a professional in the fitness field and doing a lot of group training, cycling classes, doing run workouts with some of my run classes, I am able to push my beats per minute, my heart rate up to 180, 190, and still be able to hold full sentences and full paragraphs, just because I've trained myself to do that. So if you are one of those people who've trained yourself just to have those conversations when you're doing workouts, obviously it's not going to really work much for you. So you need to look at your heart rate instead to be able to see what zone you're in. Then you have the first of the anaerobic zones. You have the super threshold zone. This zone here is just crossing that red line, that lactic threshold or that anaerobic threshold, where you go from being aerobic to being primarily anaerobic. You can only stay in this zone here for just a little bit. So we're talking about the glycolysis system that's being in play. We're talking up to that 2 minutes of energy that can be really used quite well. So that's what this zone is all about. Is 179 to 186 beats per minute. And then you have the VO2 max zone. This one here is where you're pushing the maximum amount of oxygen that your body can sustain at any one given time. And that's 5B1 and 5B2. Like I said, it doesn't really pertain much in heart rate training for cardiovascular systems, but more about weight training specifically and resistance training. So we'll talk about that at some point in a different discussion. But with the VO2 max zones, this is where you're pushing real hard, maybe for a minute, pretty much for a minute. and you're pushing hard, and then you need to take a rest somewhere between that 30 seconds and 3 minutes. You do an all-out sprint around the track, or an all-out sprint in the not an all-out sprint, but a VO2 max sprint um, in the pool, and then you have to take a big break. So this is 186 to 194 beats per minute. Then finally, you have your max or your sprint 5C heart rate zone. This is 193 to max. This is where you're doing all out. And I said all out earlier. That was incorrect. This is really the zone where you're going all out. You're pushing as hard as you possibly can, and there's really not much more that you can do. So that is the max or the sprint that we talked about. Now, these are all the heart rate zones, but there's one last thing. We talked about the lactic threshold, the anaerobic threshold line, as you can see here. And this lactic threshold, the anaerobic threshold, is where you primarily become from aerobic to anaerobic or back, and that's called interval training, basically where you're pushing for a little bit and then you back off, and you push for a little bit and then you back off, and you go and you cross this line back and forth. You cross this anaerobic or lactic threshold line, the AT or the LT line. And so this line is where you want to be able to push, right? So this really shows our performance. So most people will be between that 170 to 179 beats per minute in sub-threshold zone, but a really good athlete might be able to push 186 to 190 beats per minute for their sub-threshold zone. And so you push that lactic threshold or that anaerobic threshold higher in your heart rate zones, and you get more power and more performance out of your body because of it. And so that's why we want to push and do those intervals, because if you do an interval, your lactic threshold rises, and then you bring yourself back and you do it again and do it again, and little by little you do this consistently throughout your life or throughout your training, and your lactic threshold will go up. So that's why we want to push past that line and then back. Same thing for any exercises, any resistance training, anything of that sort. So that is heart rate training zones. We have a summary for you on this next one. We determined our max versus our resting heart rate. We determined the 8 heart rate training zones and their goals. We talked about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5A, 5B1, 5B2, and 5C. We talked about that each one of their goals has a specific reason to it. So recovery zone is for recovery workouts, keeping it low intensity to prep you for the next hard workout. Then we have our endurance zone. Our endurance zone is more long distance, so that might be an hour and a half, 2 hours of continuous training. We have our tempo zone, which is shorter. It's more about training you to develop more of a racing type feel, kind of pushing intensities a little bit more. We have the sub-threshold zone, which would be your race zone for anything longer than 2 minutes. And then we have our anaerobic zone, so our zones without oxygen. We were talking the super threshold, which is that minute to 2 minute time frame. Then we have our VO2 max zones, which is that 30-second to minute and a half time frame. And then we have our max or our sprints, all out sprints, which is somewhere between 10 seconds and 30 seconds of all out type exercise or all out type race. So just a reminder, which we did talk about in previous discussions, is a stronger cardiovascular system will recover an athlete faster from one workout to the next. So the stronger the cardiovascular system, the faster you'll be able to recover. And this goes for endurance athletes, but also for power athletes as well, so weightlifters and such. So this is why you do want to work on all the skill sets. So you don't want to just go out and do long distance all the time. You don't want to go out and say, oh, I'm doing 2.5 hours a day. You want to work on your endurance. Absolutely. Do it once a week. You want to work on your sub-threshold. You want to work on your VO2 max, but that's only once a month. So you work on all of these zones are skill sets in themselves. And so you need to work on all 8 zones at some point during your training. And that might happen once a month for many of them. And recovery workouts happen consistently. So recovery workouts should be more more frequent than a VO2 max workout. An endurance workout should happen maybe once a week. And then you have maybe a sub threshold workout throughout the week and maybe a super threshold workout throughout the week. So each one of these are skill sets that need to be worked on. So that is everything that we have for heart rate training. So thank you for tuning in to the coaching theory discussion on heart rate training, and we'll see you in the next discussion.